Welcome to the Schmooze, Calgary's weekly community podcast where we bring together the voices, events, and stories shaping Jewish life in our city. I'm Don Schapira with Jared Shore. Pull up a chair, let's schmooze.
Well, that was informative. I think I mentioned at one point throughout that conversation with Kaveh Shahrooz that I'd be taking notes because out of just pure interest to make sure it stays in my brain. But thank God we recorded that conversation. Hey.
Well, I think it's actually amazing, Don, because people, especially our younger folks, but actually, people who just aren't necessarily that interested in history, would have no idea about the long standing. And when I say long standing, I'm talking about like thousands, literally thousands of years that the Jewish people and the Persian people, the Iranians, have such a deep, rich history. And the way that things are now, and the current situation, while it seems like we are like bitter historical enemies, we're not. We're not. Actually, um, our kinship, our the commonalities are enormous, and it's actually, I think, part of our obligation as Jews to understand it and to help out our Persian friends, our Iranian brothers and sisters. They're in a fight for their lives right now.
Yeah, and I think that when people start taking a look at what the situation is, and there's that. Um, and I really don't want to use the word ignorant, but I think that it's the only word that fits. You know, it isn't the Muslim world versus the Jews in Israel. We go over and we discuss in this podcast the Iran-Iraq war, which the numbers of people killed in that war were astronomical. We talk about
Mhm.
the current situation where in the last few days, tens of thousands of Iranians would have been mad. And these are peaceful protests. This isn't armed struggle, right? And that's an important. The fear is that's what it's going to be. But currently, this is people protesting without weapons in the streets, being murdered for their politics. When we start taking a look at what the world is focused on and what it should be focused on, I just find it confuses me. This is what keeps me up at night.
Well, frankly, Kaveh was, in my opinion, pretty generous about the media coverage. He said, "Well, the media doesn't get sort of the enormity of it, and that's why we're not hearing anything about it." My my feeling is that this is a very conscious decision. I mean, if you go on to any of our Canadian mainstream media, any talk of what is happening in Iran is probably at best 20 stories deep. Okay. There are the most absurd stories that apparently our national media are thinking are more important. And frankly, I can't help but believe that's an ideological decision. What is happening in Iran has the potential to change the face of the country, change the face of the region, and change the face of the world. Their tentacles, the tentacles of the regime are everywhere, including a number of former IRGC officials that live here in Canada.
Um, with the changing face of what's happening in Iran, we wanted to reach out to somebody who can really speak to the nuances of the situation. We certainly accomplished that goal with Kaveh. We discuss his resume at length, and this episode is an important one. And the situation is so moving that this was the only time that I recall, because we're recording this on a Sunday. It's going to go live on a Friday. Between that time, significant changes on the ground could occur. And this is the first time that we went to a guest. Could we do maybe a 5 minute top up if something changes between now and when we publish? And I think that that speaks volumes to the situation.
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, it is so fluid. And I was like you, Don, you were talking about hitting refresh on Twitter constantly over the last few days to see if Trump was going to back his words. Things are quieter right now, seemingly, but we don't totally know what's happening in Iran right now. And a little spoiler, I'm not going to give away the whole thing, but towards the end of our podcast, I ask Kaveh if he thinks that Trump is actually going to do anything there. So to all our listeners, give it a listen. You'll hear his response, his prediction, and yeah, what can I tell you? Great, great conversation.
All right, guys, we're going to get right into it. We discussed last week some of the events that we have coming up for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Please keep your focus on that. There's still ongoing exhibits happening at the public library and some big things happening all on the calendar at Jewish Calgary. Please be sure to check that out. But we really are eager to get this episode out there. So we're just going to get right into it. Welcome to our episode of the Schmooze with Kaveh Shahrooz.
In times of uncertainty, one thing has always protected the Jewish community: engagement. CJPAC, the Canadian Jewish Political Affairs Committee, empowers Jewish Canadians and allies to participate in democracy, build relationships with decision makers, and stand up against anti-Semitism. Not with slogans, not with fear, but with training, civic leadership, and people who show up. Do you believe a stronger Jewish future in Canada is built through participation? Now is the time to act. Support CJPAC. Make a difference. Donate today at cjpac.ca.
Welcome to today's Schmooze podcast. It's a very special one. Today we're tackling one of the most explosive developments unfolding right now: the massive nationwide protests rocking Iran since late December. What started as economic fury over a collapsing currency, skyrocketing inflation, and post-war hardships has exploded into calls to topple the Islamic Republic itself. Millions have taken to the streets across 31 provinces, facing brutal crackdowns, internet blackouts, and reports of thousands and even tens of thousands killed in just days. This isn't just another round of unrest. It's potentially the most serious challenge the regime has faced since 1979. Now, this is also amid a backdrop of recent conflicts with Israel and a deeply weakened theocracy. To help us unpack what's happening on the ground, how it could reshape life for everyday Iranians, and what it means for the Jewish community, both the ancient population still in Iran navigating the regime's infamous anti-Semitism, and the broader implications for Jews in the region here in Canada. I'm thrilled to welcome our guest. Kaveh Shahrooz is a Toronto-based Iranian-Canadian lawyer, human rights activist, and one of the most insightful voices on Iran today. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and the University of Toronto. He served as a senior policy advisor on human rights at Global Affairs Canada and is now a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where he focuses on advancing Canada's interests abroad, particularly through accountability for authoritarian regimes. Now, Kaveh has been at the forefront of efforts to recognize the 1988 massacre of political prisoners as a crime against humanity, push for sanctions, and a support of a genuine democratic future for Iran. He is no stranger to the regime's repression. His own family fled after the execution of a relative, and he's been a sharp critic of the theocracy's genocidal rhetoric towards Israel and the Jewish people, while advocating for liberal democracy that could finally end decades of exported terror and domestic oppression. Whether you're Iranian, Jewish, or just someone who cares about human rights in the Middle East and Middle East stability, this conversation is essential. Kaveh, thank you so much for joining us on the Schmooze, and let's get right into it. I guess, how are you doing right now? And I mean, one of the questions that we had to ask at the outset is, where are the limits? I mean, are there still family back in Iran that might be in trouble, even just from a podcast like this?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on, Don and Jared. It's really an honor to be with you. How am I doing? I think, like every other Iranian person of Iranian ethnicity that lives outside the country, I am very, very nervous and sad these days to some extent. I worry about my family members, and to answer your question, yes, I do have a lot of family that still lives back in Iran. Communication with them has been very difficult, as you know. The Iranian regime, part of its playbook, whenever there are protests is to shut down the internet and shut down communication. This time they've gone even further and shut down landlines even. So getting a hold of my family has been difficult. Thankfully, we've had very brief connections with them, and thankfully they're all safe. But what they have managed to describe in the short few minutes that we talked to them is that the situation was very, very bad. The crackdown was incredibly hard, harder than they've seen it in the past, and they've frankly seen it all. So yeah, there's just that constant sense of worry and anxiety that I have, and I think a lot of people that share my ancestry have, but mixed in with a degree of optimism, the feeling that perhaps something might be happening. Now, that ebbs and flows. Some days you feel more optimistic than others, but just in the air, there's a feeling that change might be around the corner.
Kaveh, I want to just rewind just a tiny bit. I mean, Don gave an extensive bio, which is amazing. But currently you are at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.
I am
Tell
a senior fellow there.
people, right? And I mean, it's sort of a who's who of some of the best thinkers in this country. And so tell us a little bit about the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and how you came to them, a little bit about your background there.
Sure, absolutely. So the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the head offices are in Ottawa, headed up by a gentleman and a thinker named Brian Lee Crawley. But they have fellows and people that associate with them from all over the country. And there's a domestic policy program and a foreign policy program. The domestic policy focuses on all the things you would anticipate, tax policy and energy policy, national reconciliation with indigenous folks. And the foreign policy focuses on, Iran and Russia and all the external risks. And the tagline that the MLI uses is, we want to make bad policy unacceptable in Canada. And it's kind of you to put me in the category alongside the others that are at MLI. But I agree with you. I think really there are some truly sharp minds that work in that institute, all to Brian's credit for having assembled this team. My involvement actually came as a result of our mutual friend and now MP for Calgary Heritage, Shuv Majumdar. He and I had known each other when he had been in government as a staffer. I had been working at Global Affairs Canada. We'd crossed paths a little bit. And then at some point, once he left government, he headed up the foreign policy program at MLI. He asked me to join as a senior fellow. So by way of background, I mean, I was born in Iran and I lived in Iran until I was about 10 years old. So I was born just after the revolution. So I didn't experience the revolution firsthand, but I did experience the kind of the reign of terror that came after the revolution. I was a young child, but I distinctly remember it. And I also remember the Iran-Iraq War very vividly. That was my childhood. And then my family in 1990 managed to get out and come to Canada, where I lived for most of my life. I did spend nearly a decade in the US going to law school and practicing law in the US. But basically, when I was in law school, to graduate from my law school, you had to write a final thesis, basically. And I decided to write about a massacre that had taken place in Iran in the 1980s, and Don in his kind introduction made reference to it. It was a massacre of political prisoners that took place in 1988, and my own family had been affected by it. My own uncle had been killed in that massacre. And for whatever reason, and I think these are reasons that we can talk about because I think those reasons continue to be in play today. Media hadn't written much about this massacre, and human rights groups hadn't written much about this massacre. So as part of my thesis, or not as part of, as my thesis, I chose to sort of uncover the history of this massacre and do an analysis of it under international law. And in doing that, I frankly had to make a decision. I thought to myself, if I write this piece and I get it published, which was the aim, it means that I cannot go back to Iran and visit my family, because if I do that, I will almost certainly be arrested. But I realized that I was in a unique place. I had access to the Harvard Library that had these incredible resources about this massacre that had taken place. And so I made that determination then. This was, many years ago, but I decided that it was worth it. And that kind of set me on a path where I've been, professionally I've been practicing law, but almost parallel with that, I've been doing a lot of policy work focused on a lot of different things, but a lot of it on Iran and hoping to build a democratic movement there. Some of that has involved bringing attention to these legacy crimes that happened, for example, in the 1980s that people don't talk about anymore. But I think it's really important to remember this, that this regime was conceived in blood. It spilled a lot of blood to get power. And a lot of the people that were implicated in those killings are now in positions of power still in Iran. So it was not an impediment for them. It actually helped boost their careers, and they rose the ranks because they had taken part in these mass killings. And so, yeah, I focused a lot on these legacy crimes, and then in the last few years, there has been a lot of efforts on building kind of a democratic opposition that can push back against this regime.
And so I think that one of the things and one of the tools that maybe Israelis or Jews who are Zionist have been experiencing, especially over the last couple of years, is that we kind of sometimes have to go a step back and fight against these these colonial labels and I think it would be really important, we talk about Hasbara or Israel 101. I think maybe we need a little bit of Iran 101 because
Sure.
I only learned, I think it was like 2 months ago. So I was like today years old when I learned that there were flights from Tel Aviv to Tehran back and
Yeah.
forth, which I never even, my brain just doesn't accept that as a reality. So what was Iran before? Because there was also some problems. It was problematic even before that. But
Yeah.
not going back to ancient times,
Mhm.
but let's go back in modern history, about
Sure.
modern political history. Let's say after World War One, where was it a democracy? Was it, was the Shah? What happened with the Shah? How did it convert to the theocracy that it is now? Because you mentioned that there was a bloody revolution, and so it was built from blood, but it's also been maintained by that same blood. So,
Yeah.
a little bit of understanding as to what gets us to today before we can fully analyze it. I always feel that that's helpful.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, an excellent framing of it. If you'll permit me, I'll go back just a little bit before World War One, because I
Okay,
think where you start your historical retelling has an effect on kind of how you see the world. So I
perfect,
think
perfect.
probably the right place to start for me is actually 1906. 1906, Iran has 20th century's first sort of democratic revolution. It's the Iranian. It's referred to as the Iranian constitutional revolution. So Iran had had this monarchical. Well, it had monarchies all through its history,
Right.
but at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, they had this dynasty called the Qajars, and they were, it was a dynasty that was kind of falling apart. Iran had really been left behind from modernity, but there was really this push for something resembling democracy in 1906, where a lot of different groups came together and they demanded, rule of law, that, an end to a monarch's absolute rule. They wanted justice, they wanted institutions of the modern state, and they were successful for a period. So it was a very short period, about 10 years or so, where there was a sort of a constitutional government, but with it came a fair degree of chaos. And out of that chaos came a strong man who would be the father of the Shah, so Reza Shah. So he was the first Pahlavi king, and he sort of came to dominate the political space. He initially thought about setting Iran up as a republic and him becoming a president, but he decided that he actually wanted to establish Iran as a monarchy, sort of in keeping with Iranian tradition. So he took on the name of Reza Pahlavi. He became Reza Shah, Shah, the word meaning king. And he modernized Iran in a lot of ways. He built a railroad, he built a justice system, he built a modern bureaucracy. So, to his credit, he sort of dragged Iran into the 20th century.
Okay.
One of the more controversial things he did was he forced men to wear Western dress, and forced women to remove the hijab. And that was a controversial choice at the time. A lot of women, because the families were religious, chose to actually just stay home and not come out because they just, like, to them, it was just like nudity in public. But he dragged the country in some ways kicking and screaming into the 20th century. And to his credit, like to this day, when people protest in Iran, a lot of them, one of the common chants is Reza Shah, may your memory be a blessing or something. But it's not to confuse that with with democracy. He built a lot of modern institutions, but he did not bring democracy along with it. It was a very authoritarian state. Post World War II, so Iran tried to stay neutral, but frankly, Reza Shah had certain, well, first of all, he had problems with the British, but also certain leanings towards the Germans. And so the Allies actually kicked him out of the country. So Reza Shah ended up dying in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken, actually, because he had been exiled from Iran by the Allied forces. And his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, became king. Now, he was kind of not a particularly strong monarch up until the 1950s. And in 1953, there was an incident, and this is a point of great contention. So I'm going to tell you sort of two versions of the story and leave it to you and your audience to kind of do their own reading and make their own determination. So one version of the story says that the prime minister in 1953, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized Iran's oil, and he faced resistance from the Shah, who didn't want to kind of go along with this. And the Shah removed him from power illegally. And so people poured out in the streets and they protested against the Shah. The Shah escaped and went to Italy, if I'm not mistaken, for a period of time. And so there was a brief period when Iran didn't have a king and it had this prime minister who had nationalized the oil and was very popular. And then the CIA and the MI6 showed up in Iran with suitcases full of money, and they kind of brought people out in the streets, got rid of this prime minister, and brought the Shah back. And post 1953, post 1953, I don't think this piece is in dispute, Iran became a much more authoritarian kind of state. So that's one version of the story that's told by opponents of the Shah. Supporters of the Shah will tell a slightly different story. They will say, yes, Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the oil, but it was a foolish thing to do. It made Iran ripe for Soviet incursion. And they will say that the Shah of Iran had every right to remove Mossadegh as a prime minister. It had been the prerogative of the king to remove prime minister. So there was no coup. It was the king practicing what was his normal power. There was an effort to oust the king illegally, but eventually, people brought him back. Now, this is 1953, 75 years ago, but people continue to fight about this issue because I think it has a lot of implications about whether or not how legitimate the Shah was after 1953. And so, again, I don't want to take a position on that, but I think it's an important point to know. What is important to know is that post 1953, the Shah closed down a lot of political space. So he was very, very worried about another coup of this nature. He was very worried about the Soviets, not unreasonably. I mean, the Soviets were in the region and they were always in the mix.
Right.
And so he was very worried about, communists taking power. And the Communist Party in Iran was quite powerful at that time.
Yeah.
So he closed all sorts of political space for them. They were not allowed to organize, put a lot of them in prison, whatever. But the one force that was allowed to kind of exist, and the Shah mistakenly thought of it as a kind of a bulwark against communism, it was the mosque. It was the religious clerics. And the mosque became a hub of activity against the Shah eventually. And they were the only ones that were permitted to organize. They were the only ones that were permitted to fundraise. And they had deep roots in the community. And so one particular cleric, very backward-looking man, who in the 1960s, for example, was exiled from Iran because he opposed the Shah's granting the franchise to women. That was the point of contention, was Ayatollah Khomeini. He was kicked out of Iran. He went to Iraq for a time, and then in the late 70s, he went to Paris, where he had access to the world's media. And Iran became, because it was such an authoritarian state, it was modernizing economically. So to his credit, the Shah continued his father's work of dragging Iran into the 20th and close to the 21st century, built up a very powerful military, built up a very powerful economy. Iran had very strong standing in the world and relatively good relations with Israel, and we can talk about that as well. But it was not democratic. Again, it remained authoritarian. And a lot of academics talk about this mismatch between the economic advancement on the one hand, but no political advancement. So suddenly you had a population that was getting richer, more powerful, sort of more standing in the world, but they had no political voice. And that kind of led to this explosion in the late 1970s. And the only people that had been able to organize were the religious folks. It was kind of and sorry if I'm going on too long. I feel
this is amazing. This is absolutely I'm like, I'd be taking notes if I didn't hit the record button. This is amazing.
Mm.
And so what happened was there was kind of this coalition that came together of religious folks and the leftists and basically everybody, and not very many liberals, frankly. Like Iran in the 1970s was not a breeding ground for a lot of liberal democratic thought. This was a lot of post-colonialism was in the air, a lot of leftist Marxist thought was in the air. So these religious groups and these Marxist groups kind of created this alliance, and I think the thinking always was among the leftists, here are these backwards clerics. We're going to join with them because they have the political muscle. They're going to overthrow the Shah, and then we will get rid of them, and Iran will become a communist state. But Khomeini managed to outplay all these guys. Like the Shah was ousted through a revolution. This is a revolution that built for about a year. Again, to his credit, the Shah could have clamped down in a very, it's not to say that this revolution wasn't bloody, but it could have been far, far bloodier. But the Shah didn't want to murder his own people. And the army at some point just declared neutrality, said, we're not going to fire on the protesters. And that was basically the end of the monarchy. So the Shah fled, and Khomeini came back to Iran. And at that point, there was about a year or two of political jockeying between these different groups, and the clerics and the Islamists proved to be incredibly ruthless, and they basically carried out massacres. First of the members of the previous regime, and then the leftists that had been their allies, as a lot of revolutions tend to be. One group tends to kill their former allies. And here they did that, and then there was a war. So Saddam Hussein launched an attack against Iran in 1980, and that gave the regime a lot of power to kind of get rid of, once it was on war footing, all dissent was shut down. The power came to be entirely concentrated in the hands of Khomeini, and that kind of gets us to 1989 when he died, and that's sort of the start of the current supreme leader, Khamenei, where Iran, in my view, became far less of an ideological state, like it had been a revolutionary Islamic state before then. It became a much more kind of military focused. The IRGC came to be created, or at least strengthened by Khamenei as a parallel power base against the traditional military. And then the IRGC now is also a massive economic force. It's a very corrupt power base in Iran that is both military and economic, has immense power in both spheres.
Well, you give us an unbelievable history. I know the history of Iran and Persia is so vast. When you said I'll go back a little further, I was wondering if you were going to go back to Cyrus the Great, but we'll talk about Cyrus at some point. You alluded to the media and human rights organizations, and seemingly an complete abdication of responsibility at this point. Okay, so you've brought us briefly through some historical context, but as we're looking at what is happening in Iran today, given how the media is completely ignoring it, human rights organizations by and large are ignoring it, and we'll talk about that. What do we know is happening in Iran over the last couple weeks, a few days?
Mm-hmm.
What do we know?
Yeah, so look, let's be fair. I don't think it's fair to say that the media has been completely ignoring the story. The mainstream media has covered it, but in my view, and I share this with you, I don't think it's been sufficient. I don't think they have put enough focus on it, and I don't think they appreciate the gravity of what's happening and the tragedy that's unfolding. So Iran has had basically, well, shortly after the revolution, there was a slight, not a slight, but there was an uprising, but that was crushed pretty quickly. But in terms of kind of more modern protests in Iran, in 1999 there was a student uprising, and then there have been kind of these uprisings every few years, but the time between them has been getting shorter and shorter because Iran's regime has been on this kind of downward cycle in terms of just economically, internationally, it's been getting more isolated, and the other part of it is that Iranians themselves are much more connected to the world than, let's say, like North Koreans. They have internet, they have satellite television. So their demand the demands of the news generation have also been increasing. So we've seen these protests happening over and over again. And then a couple of weeks ago, in late December, a number of members of Iran or Tehran's bazaar began to, like, they went on strike. They shut down the bazaar and they began to protest. The bazaar in Iran, those of you that are familiar with the Middle East, is basically like Wall Street. It's kind of where the business happens. So it's kind of the merchant class, and the merchant class has traditionally actually been fairly religious, and it's been fairly supportive of this regime. So it's, significant that this is kind of where the protest began. And their initial complaint was economics. So Iran is the regime is incredibly corrupt. So they've been stealing from the public purse. Much of the public wealth has been siphoned off and sent to, Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. Not only is the regime corrupt, but it's also incredibly inept and incompetent. And so they have been wasting public funds. And on top of this, Iran has been chasing the nuclear bomb for, I don't know, how long has it been now? 15 years, 10 years at least. And that means that Iran has become an international pariah. It's sanctioned. And in recent months, sanctions were reimposed. Donald Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, if you recall, back in 2018, I want to say, in his first term. And then just a few months ago, the United Nations reimposed sanctions on Iran in a process that's called the snapback of sanctions. And so what that meant was that the Iranian currency, the rial, just went into free fall. And so it was felt by everybody, but the merchant class, really first and foremost, they began to see the business really suffer. And so they shut down businesses and they began to protest. And very, very quickly, this spread across the country. So suddenly there were dozens of cities, and then 50 cities and 100 cities were protesting, or villages were protesting, and it's just a cross section of the Iranian public. So be it working class people, the elites, liberals, leftists, everybody was on the streets. Add to this a couple of things. One is that Iran's regime has pushed very, very hard against Iranian nationalism. To them, like you need to sort of understand something about Islamic thought, is that they don't really recognize nationalism as legitimate. The fact that I am Iranian or you are, Iraqi or Israeli or whatever, they don't recognize these things. For them, the important piece of identity is that we are fellow Muslims. So we have to think of ourselves as part of a Muslim nation. But Iranians have been very sickened by this, and so Iranian nationalism has kind of been gaining ground in the last few years as kind of a resistance to this regime. And so that has brought with it as kind of a nostalgia for what Iran was before the revolution, and with it the fortunes of the son of the former Shah have risen. So his name is Reza Pahlavi. He's based in the U.S. So he issued a call for people to come out in the streets shortly after these bazaar protests began, and so a lot of people took heart in that, and they decided to come out. And to top it all off, Donald Trump put out a tweet saying, if Iran harms these protesters, the United States is locked and loaded. And that was kind of I think the ultimate bit of fuel on this fire, because Iranians had been protesting for a number of years. Their anger and aggravation of the United States has been, why are you not supporting us? In 2009, there had been this uprising. Again, I'm jumping all over the place. But in 2009, there had been this uprising where one of the main slogans that people were shouting in the streets was, and the rhyme doesn't really work in English, but the Farsi chant was, Obama, Obama, you're either with them or with us. And this phrase rhymes in Farsi. The idea being like, Obama, you have to kind of come to our side. Like, you have to help us. We need your help. And Obama stayed silent. Donald Trump did not. Rhetorically, he gave the support, and it was interpreted as, well, once we take to the streets, the United States is going to come in and help, much like they, attacked Iran, a few months earlier during the 12-day war. But regrettably, that has not been the case. And Iran's regime and security apparatus did what it always does. So it shut down all communication, and that has two effects. One, inside the country, people can't coordinate, and they can't get the message out to outside the country as to what's happening. In the last few years, people have had some success in getting Starlink devices smuggled into Iran. So news is coming out in bits and pieces. And what we can gather is that there has been an absolute bloodbath. So live bullets shot into crowds of people. Sorry, you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, because, and I think that right now is a really good sort of a point to ask, where we are right now, because it's multifaceted. So, and you have, I don't feel like you've been jumping around. I think that you've really set the table now for where we're at, because as we stand right now, and I mean, things change so fast. When we first chatted with you just a few days ago, the attack on Iran from the United States just appeared to be imminent. Like it was everybody felt that it was a done deal. And now we're kind of maybe in a different reality, but maybe, we have no idea what's happening. We have no idea. Conservative estimates are that around 1,000 people, or it was 600 people killed, 800 people arrested, and now reports of people still in their hospital. There's video of people still, in hospital bandages with bullets to the forehead. So like in the hospitals, they were massacred. The numbers have now inflated to the possibility of over 50,000 people murdered just in the last week, or in the last few days, in terms of a crackdown. Where are we as it stands right now?
Mhm.
And then obviously the follow up is, what do you think is going to happen tomorrow and
Yeah.
the next day?
Yeah, so in terms of where we are right now, it seems like, at least for the moment, the regime has managed to take back control of the streets, which is significant because if the US had gotten involved, things might look very, very different. But there was no attack from the United States, despite Trump, aside from his locked and loaded tweet, he kept talking about Iran. At one point, a few days ago, he put out a tweet saying, stay in the streets, take over institutions, help is on the way. Today's reporting from the New York Times and elsewhere seems to suggest that actually help really was on the way, but some of the Arab states and perhaps Israel actually asked them to hold off because they weren't ready for the conflict that might generate. But it seems like there was massive killing. Now, exactly what that number looks like, I don't know. Very conservative estimates put it at several thousand, 3,000 or 4,000. I've seen numbers up to 20,000. Iran International, which is a satellite television station based in London, but it's everybody kind of looks to it as the central television station. I'm not sure what they base the 20,000 figure on, but whatever it is, it's a horrendous number. And as you say, it has been absolutely brutal. They have been just merciless, going into hospitals and shooting people in hospitals. One of the things that Iran's regime did. So there was a mass uprising in 2022. People often refer to it as the Masa Amini uprising, Woman Life Freedom uprising, and they began this process of shooting prisoners in the eye. That they specifically targeted people's eyes. So you had hundreds of people blinded during those protests, and it seems like the regime is continuing to do this, just as a way of, setting an example that we will be cruel to you, and they've been doing that as well. And aside from that, they have detained tens of thousands of people. And this is a regime that will not hesitate to execute large numbers to send a message across. We began our conversation, me telling you about this massacre that happened in 1988.
Right.
This was, thousands of political prisoners that had already gone through kangaroo courts and been sentenced to, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years in prison. Midway through their sentence, because it was beneficial politically to the regime, they quote unquote tried all these people again, brought them before kangaroo courts, and just killed them all, massacred them all. So it is not unprecedented. It is expected, and I would say it's likely that Iran's regime will continue to massacre its detainees. So that's where we are now, and the regime has, at least at the moment, taken back control. But I think it's very, very shaky control because the geopolitical context remains what it is. Donald Trump is still in the White House. Israel and Iran are still on more or less on a war footing. And the grievances that Iranians have not been addressed. So there's no reason to think this will not flare up again in a week's time, a month's time. It's all of it is, all the elements are there. It just needs another spark.
Gotcha.
Kaveh, does this uprising, or any uprising from the Iranian people, have a shot without intervention from the United States? And frankly, at this point, if they were encouraged the way they were, if they were let down by Obama the way they were in 2009, if they were hung out to dry, if it turns out they were hung out to dry by Donald Trump, where does it go from here for the Iranian people? I mean, how can they have any faith if what they are relying on is American intervention? How do they have any faith at this point if this turns out to have been
Yeah.
bluster from Donald Trump?
Great question. Um, Donald Trump, predicting what Donald Trump is going to do is really a fool's errand. So it's possible that later on today he will take action and it will make everything we say moot.
Hmm.
But if, as you say, if America does not end up doing anything or punishing Iran's regime, it will have a couple of effects. One, it will prove that any red line drawn by an American president, Republican or Democrat, is utterly meaningless, right? You will recall Obama drew a red line for Bashar al-Assad, saying if you use chemical weapons, we're going to come after you, and he did nothing, and that was a disaster. This was similarly a red line drawn by President Trump, and if he doesn't act on it, it just means that America's word means nothing. And it will frankly be seen as a tremendous, tremendous betrayal. A lot of people went out in the streets and risked their lives on the assumption that the regime will have to back down because America has the protesters back. And if it doesn't, I think there's going to be a great deal of disillusionment about this project and America's role as being on the side of those that want democracy. And I also fear that there's a possible dark turn that these things could take, which is that if people feel that it's not enough for us to just come out in the streets and protest, we're always just going to be shot down. I worry that they will begin to think about acquiring weapons and actually fighting the regime. And that I see almost that mood begin to take hold. I follow social media a lot. I begin to see the analysis start to go that way, saying, well, armed struggle is really the only way. And to my mind, that's absolutely a disaster. It's just, first of all, there is no way that Iranians are going to be able to arm themselves in such a way as to fight the IRGC. The IRGC is armed to the teeth, and it is militant and it's ruthless. So we're not going to win if we go down this path. And secondly, there goes the path of just the balkanization of the country. Separatist movements come in, and just like, the Syria model could really play itself out. Now, Iran's regime has been very keen on putting out this fear in the minds of people that that if you guys revolt, Iran will turn into Syria. And I genuinely do worry, and up until now I've said that's nonsense, but I genuinely do worry that if people go down this path of armed struggle, then we may actually see Iran's situation play out like Syria's, which I think would be absolutely horrendous.
When we talk about interventionism and what it's led to, I mean, in my lifetime, the map has shifted so much just in the Middle East. I mean, from what Iraq was pre-Saddam to what it is now, I can't even define what Iraq is right now in terms of stability. Syria, the same way. Lebanon seems, after the war, to have strengthened certain things. When we talk about Donald Trump in the 12-day war, just 10 days before he struck the nuclear facilities, he said, okay, we're not going to do anything. We're hoping dialogue will happen. And then he did. So, like you said, for us to guess what Donald Trump would do, I think is definitely a fool's errand. But we're in a climate right now where information and Starlink and things like that do get kind of smuggled in and do happen. The problem is, I think that you're alluding to, Kaveh, is that the Shah was, at the end of the day, he made a decision not to sacrifice the Iranian people that ultimately really sacrificed many of the Iranian people in terms of that. Today, it's a theocracy. So now it's not just a political movement. It is our religious duty to lead this country. So it carries much more weight, and the chance of them making the right choice of stepping down, I just don't think is in the cards, right? Especially if, the belief that their death is martyrship and that real belief. What we fail to realize is that, and you alluded to it as well, Iran isn't Arab. It's not part of the Arab, it's Persian, and it has its own rich history. And when we start talking about the protests that happened in late 70s, you were saying leftists and theocracy, right? These were communists. These were people on the left, people who are very, believing in this utopian leftist liberal ideology that combined with the Ayatollah to create this. And we're starting to see some of this on campuses here, where the left and these murderous ideals combine into a singular protest movement. which is quite scary, especially, considering recent history. Is that why our campuses today are silent about Iran? Because there is no huge protest that I'm seeing.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a rally, there's a pro-Iranian rally that's happening today at 2 o'clock here in Calgary. I will be there. But what's the counter movement? What is the argument
Yeah.
against this? I'm not understanding that,
Mhm, mhm.
but I'm seeing it.
Yeah. Let me play devil's advocate. I don't actually agree with this, but I think the argument that some folks would make as to why they are not out on campuses is that they would say, look, there's not really much that we can do here in Canada or in the United States or elsewhere about what is happening in Iran. We can't affect what the Iranian regime does. If you're in Canada or the US, we don't even have diplomatic relations with Iran. Um, we are going to save our energy for those matters on which we can actually affect domestic policy. So Canada sells arms to Israel, so we're going to take to the streets and we're going to occupy campus buildings because we want to change that policy in our own country. I happen to think that's a very disingenuous argument, simply because, uh, I think there is, much of the protest movement has not actually focused on changing Canadian policy. I live in Toronto in a heavily Jewish neighborhood. There are protesters that walk down residential streets with Palestinian flags here. And I really do have to wonder what what my neighborhood has to do with Canadian policy. This is not something that's directed at changing Canadian policy. There's something much darker and more sinister happening.
Right.
And secondly, the reason I think it's disingenuous is that for much of the time that I've been following Iran very closely, not only has the left been silent on Iran, which is I think bad, which would be bad enough, but at least I would understand it on the basis that I just said because we can't affect what happens in Iran. But I've seen a fair bit of sympathy towards the Iranian regime and a fair bit of being charitable and giving the Iranian regime the benefit of the doubt, trying to justify its actions, saying, oh, we ought to normalize relations with Iran, even though Iran's regime, this is a point I keep making in arguments and in interviews and things like that. This is like just taking all the other politics out of it. If you were to imagine a regime that is against everything the left purportedly stands for, it would look a lot like the Iranian regime. The left is supposedly, secular in outlook. This is a theocracy. The left cares about workers. Iran does not allow labor unions to operate freely and actually kidnaps and kills labor union leaders. The left says it cares about women and LGBTQ people. Iran has a horrendous record of its treatment of them, and by law, this is actually written into the law, Iran is effectively a gender apartheid state. Women are worth less than men. I could keep going with this list. So it just boggles the mind that the left would stay silent and be charitable towards this regime. So I think what's going on is that, regrettably, I think in recent years, maybe it's not recent, I don't know. The left has come to just apply one lens to all political issues, international issues, and that lens is anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. And in their mind, if a regime postures as being anti-American, anti-Israel, and hence anti-imperialist, it is one that they will support. And if a population is rising up and they're pro-American and pro-Israel, then the left interprets that as, well, either these people are foolish and we're not going to support them, or something that you hear a lot nowadays, like this is actually a color revolution led by the United States and Mossad, and so we ought to oppose it. I think it's just the absolute wrong lens to apply to any of these things, but regrettably, it's too often been the case with the left.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I think you've given the reality of how this cognitive dissonance plays out, where these people have these feelings about social justice, yet what clearly their behavior doesn't follow that. But you started with perhaps how they rationalize that in their own minds, or how they can explain it. Well, we don't have an impact on Iran. I think that's actually really helpful because I've not heard anything that resembles a coherent argument as to why none of these people who are obsessed with Gaza, obsessed with Palestinians, don't view Iranians the same way in their quest for freedom. Now, it's so tempting to get into that. But really, our mind should be on how to support the Iranian people ourselves. Let's forget these people who have facile ideas about oppressed and oppressor. Um, we have a long and rich history, the Jewish people with the Iranian people and the Persian people and it does go back to Cyrus the
Yes, it
Great.
does.
Okay, so those of you who don't know, and these are in biblical days when the Jews were exiled from Judea, and Cyrus the Great, king of Persia,
Correct. Correct.
he defeated the Babylonians, who kicked out the Jews from the what we now know as the land of Israel, and said, you are free to return. And it was really the start. It's been echoed. It's like it feels like I'm not a particularly observant or religious person, though very much a Jew and a Zionist, and it feels like there's a reminder to us, our obligation to each other, between Iranians, Persians, and Jews, that we have a historic bond. And so that's important here on the streets of Canada. Let me ask you, Kaveh, um, two things. One is, we know that there have been some reports about IRGC presence in Canada, former members of the regime, and we also know that there are many on the Free Iranian side, people who want to see uh, the Khomeini regime gone. And so, where is there tension there on the streets of Canada between pro-regime, anti-regime? Secondly, can the Jewish community, given how challenging things are, and is there a welcoming of the Jewish community to help out the Iranian protesters here, or is the Iranian community feeling like, hey, we got it? What do
Mm.
you think?
Great questions. So let me answer your second question first.
Okay.
There is very much a welcoming of Israeli help and support. Now, the Iranian community, obviously, in Canada is very large. I don't know the exact
Mhm.
numbers. We expect that it's around 300,000 people. There are going to be a lot of different opinions, but I think by
Sure.
and large, from what I gather and I observe and I talk to people all the time, there is this incredible feeling of solidarity between Iranians and Israel. Now, I, for one, am somebody who, I'll be frank with you, I'm very, very critical of the Netanyahu government, for example. But I think, that should not stop us from building a strong link between Iran and Israel. Israel is a vibrant democracy, and it's not flawless. Like no country is flawless, but there are these debates happening, and I think there are a lot of people that, if you're Iranian and want freedom for Iran, there are a lot of different groups in Israel that you can sort of connect with and have solidarity with. And I think that's welcomed, and I think you see that a lot. Actually, increasingly, these last few protests that I see, people not only come with the Iranian flag, the one that predates the Islamic Republic, the one that has the lion and the sun, but a lot of them increasingly come with Israeli flags because they want to express that solidarity. So it's not only is it not rejected, it's actually welcomed. So that's
Right.
that. In terms of whether there is tension between the two different groups, so there's actually tension, interestingly, and this kind of goes back to our earlier conversation, between Iranians who want revolution and a small group of far left activists, both Iranian and non-Iranian, who frame their opposition to these protests as, being against foreign interference or foreign intervention. They say, how, you guys didn't care about the killings in Gaza, why should we care about you? So that tension plays out a little bit. Whether, like, there is not actually, to my mind, much tension between the Iranians in this country and the regime official. There are certainly regime officials here, but they keep a pretty low profile. I mean, they're not going to be out there counter protesting and stating their support for the regime. They want to blend in as much as possible. It's actually the lefties, the far lefties, that I think are actually more of the visible problem.
And so when we take a look at actionable steps that I could do, right, and maybe less so for me because my MP and my writing is a strong support, but the IRGC in Canada is not listed as a terrorist organization.
It is now listed as
it is now. And how recent is that?
Maybe 6 months, but I mean, this is a file that we worked on for years and years, and we kept getting told by the Trudeau government that it was coming just around the corner, and they only took action like 6 months ago.
Which is fantastic. So what other steps can we because if we're looking at MPs who are out there worried about getting reelected and have to appeal to their own demographic, and that's a quote from a foreign from a former foreign advisor to Trudeau. So what can we do? What letters can we write? What do we need to do in Canada? You know, we started talking about the steps that some of these vocal pro-left mobs are doing. What can we do as reasonable citizens who see what's happening in Iran and are just heartbroken, right? Because, you know, the next step is armed resistance, and that is going to lead to an extraordinarily bloody affair. So what pressures can we help build? Like, is there a letter that we can say this is an actionable step that Canada can take? And so we're now pressuring our MPs in order to take those steps, because, you know, I listen to Allied Voices for a Strong Canada, and it doesn't take much. A few letters, a few, you know, real conversations with our local MPs can actually change the tide.
Exactly. So you said later on today you're heading to a protest at the University of Calgary. I encourage all your listeners, if there are protests for a free Iran, attend them, because those things actually matter. Politicians are very well tuned to kind of who's out on the streets and what that means. So, you know, express your support for these protests. Write to your local MP, and what you should ask of them, as I just said a few minutes ago, the IRGC is now listed as a terror organization, but quite honestly, it has been more symbolic than anything. If anything, the people that have been harmed by this listing have been some folks that I know who, as part of their mandatory military service, were forced to go to the IRGC for a couple of years, and then now, and they were open about it to the immigration authorities, and now they're suddenly caught in this problem of they were listed as a terror organization. The people that are actually in this country who had long-standing ties with the IRGC, who were higher up in the IRGC, who have brought a lot of money here that's been stolen from Iran, those people have not much action has been taken against them. So, excuse me. So the letter that you should be writing to your MP and the meeting that you should be going to, and telling them, look, we now have laws on the books that say the IRGC is a terrorist organization, and we have immigration laws that say if you were within a certain, you know, rank in the Iranian regime, you're not allowed in this country. We need to enforce these laws, right? And I think life just needs to be made much more uncomfortable for these people in Canada. And the other thing that's really important is that once the regime starts to crumble, and I have no doubt that it will, a lot of those rats are going to jump off the sinking ship, and they are going to come to Canada. Canada will be like Argentina post-World War II, I have no doubt. And the reason for that is over the past decade, Iranian regime officials in large numbers have been coming here, sending their families here, putting their money into property here in Canada, in Calgary, in Vancouver, in Toronto. You know, this sort of thing gets in the news every once in a while, where somebody's just walking down the street and they run into like their torturer from Iran. Tehran's police chief was seen in Thornhill, just north of Toronto, working out at a local gym. I mean, this was a guy who had been responsible for putting down protests for killing, you know, Canadian citizens, and no one bothered to put his name into Google before issuing him a visa to come into this country. It's shocking to me. So that's the kind of thing. I mean, it's the very basic stuff that we can do to make life uncomfortable for regime affiliates in Canada and not to let them in. Also, beyond that, I mean, rhetorically, we need to support the protesters. You know, support them with Starlink. I mean, there is limited things that Canada can do. Canada is not that major a player on the international scene at this point. Like pressure on Donald Trump to actually take action to cripple Iran's repressive apparatus, I think that would be much more useful. But that's not something Canada can really do, frankly. But there are things that we can do that I just mentioned, and those things we ought to do.
Yeah, it's the build of small little bits of pressure even regardless of where Canada is, me writing a letter slowly with the addition of others helps build pressure, helps build a movement. Sorry,
Exactly.
Jared, go ahead.
Sorry before you jump in. I mean, what you got to think about is politicians. God bless them. I know a number of them. They really care about two things at the end of the day. They care about fundraising and they care about votes. And they understand in the MPs' offices that a letter from, like, if somebody took the effort and took the trouble of writing a letter, that means that there's probably 20 or 50 other people in the riding who feel the same way.
Right.
So
Mhm.
that letter writing is not a letter sent to the void. It's actually a pretty strong message that, fundraising is at stake and votes are at stake. So you better take action.
Kaveh, do you have a sense? I mean, I know a few numbers have been bandied around, and you've actually clarified that perhaps some of these within these numbers that have been quoted are folks who didn't serve in the IRGC willingly or certainly at any kind of high level. Any sense of what that number looks like here in Canada in terms of how many folks have been identified as more that
Mm-hmm.
upper level?
Good question. There is a number that gets thrown around a lot in the media and by politicians. They say 700 IRGC officials are in this country. Now,
Hmm.
I know the folks that put that list together, and I don't know if they were necessarily very rigorous in that. So I don't know if that number is true. But and the problem is not just the IRGC. I mean, the IRGC is one part of it. Iran's regime has a lot of different tentacles, so to speak.
Hmm.
I don't know what the number is, but the number is large. And the reason that has happened is that in the last 15 years or so, frankly, and it's not just a liberal problem. It actually goes back to the Harper government. Bless Stephen Harper. He was very, very good on Iran on a number of issues, but on this one thing, I think it was a policy mistake, which was that our immigration system changed somewhat so that a lot of investors could more easily come to Canada. And the people that had the types of money needed to come as investors were people like in Iran, you don't really prosper unless you have ties to the regime. And
Hmm.
so people with ties to the regime increasingly came here, brought their families here, put their money in investments here. And so I think overall, I mean, it's easy to say like hundreds of people, if not thousands of people with significant ties to the regime are in this country. And every once in a while, some of it gets discovered. I get calls from people in our community constantly telling me like, oh, such and such a person was, involved with the IRGC in some way. What do I do with this information? And I try to pass it on to my contacts, in the police or intelligence or whatever.
Hmm.
Like the system's very badly designed. I shouldn't be the guy that gets that information. Like there should be a much easier way of people passing on this
Right.
information. Regrettably, we don't have that right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I I take a look at, always it's always good to personalize a story. And I was mentioning this to you before we kind of pressed record, Kevin, that there's a local restaurant here. And after October 7th, and realizing the support that Iranians have for Israel, there's a local restaurant called Terme here in Calgary, just up in Signal Hill. And my wife and I went there, and she's wearing her McGinn I had my hostage pin on. We don't hide where we come from. We sat down, ready to eat, and right away the waitress comes up to us. So oh, you're from Israel. We love Bibi. We love regardless of that, but very much a supporter. So obviously we started asking what her story was and what brought her to Canada. And she was very successful. She had a career in Iran. Her husband had a career in Iran. And then she was blacklisted for the crime of getting a photo taken at Niagara Falls without a hijab. That photo made its way to a sister who showed it to a friend, and that friend then showed it to her boss. And that's it. She's now blacklisted.
Mm.
Just like that.
Yep. Yep.
And it didn't take much. And now, she was upset, but she was also happy, living in Canada. But, the idea that your life can be ripped from you for a photograph of simply not wearing, it's not that it's with her husband. It was a honeymoon photo taken at Niagara Falls.
Yeah.
And that's the punishment. When we're reminded of the stake of what we're talking about, the Iranian people are very strong, and and regardless of the size, there's 300,000 here in Canada. Their voices are loud, and their voices should be heard. And I really do believe that from the smallest of actions to the biggest of steps, anything we do moves the needle.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I'm really glad you told me that story because a story like that, tragic though it is very common. And earlier today we were talking about how many people were killed. Was it 5,000? Was it 20,000? Whatever. Sometimes these numbers just become abstract concepts, and we forget that there's actually lives behind these things.
Exactly.
I had an uncle killed in 1988 that I mentioned earlier, and that ripped my family apart. My mother was never the same when she lost her brother. My grandmother was never the same after losing her son. That really changed the trajectory of my life, and it brought so much sadness and misery to our lives that to this day I think still play itself out. And there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people that have experienced this incredible trauma that has happened, over something simple as a photograph. People's lives have been ruined. Um, yeah, I mean, really, all you can do as a Jewish community that knows what trauma is like, you've experienced it on a much grander scale, but you understand how it sort of ripples through generations and through families. It's really important for us to kind of have these conversations and for us to amplify each other's voices because, if we don't bring these kinds of cries for help to the attention of the world, like who will, right? It's really critical that we aid each other in that.
Kaveh, we're so appreciative of you bringing your breadth of knowledge to us, and um, I think for so many of our listeners, they're just going to have a greater sense of not only the history between the Iranian people and the Jewish people, but also our responsibility to each other, especially in the current climate. I hope that every casualty is not in vain that we've seen over the last couple weeks. I do uh, hope to the depth of my being that there is positive change coming, because positive change coming to Iran means positive change coming to the region and to the world. I think we all know that. Um, you're an academic, you're a lawyer, you're a senior fellow at a think tank. I know this is probably not your comfort level, but I'm going to ask you, is Trump going to intervene? I just want to know your as our
Yeah,
wrap up, what's
yeah.
going to happen?
So I will put my cards on the table and let you know. But these are not very secret cards because if anyone looks me up on social media, they will almost immediately see this. I am staunchly anti-Trump. I find him to be a very
Hmm.
dangerous figure on the international stage,
Hmm.
and I have no faith that he will come through. Now, do I think that he will
Hmm.
strike Iran? I actually think that he will strike Iran, simply because it's really important to him to look macho and
Hmm.
he's made this vow, so I think there will be a strike. But what I worry about is that it will be a strike that serves his ego, but doesn't actually serve Iranian protesters. So it will be an attack on something that doesn't actually change the calculation. Or I worry that what he will do will be something akin to the Venezuela model, which is to just
Hmm.
decapitate the regime, take out one or two senior figures, but just leave the structure intact. And regrettably, I don't think that's going to solve anything because this is a system-wide problem. It's not an individual problem. That if you take out, the supreme leader, everything's going to be fine. That's not how the regime works.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
actually have to make a wholesale change. So I do think Trump will get involved, but regrettably, I think that moment has passed, at least for the moment, for U.S. intervention to really be effective.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really is. And I was just chatting with Jared about this just yesterday about today's podcast. That when we contacted you to record this podcast, there was a completely different
Yeah.
feel and optimism over
Yeah.
regime change. Because I really felt at that time like this is gonna happen. Like I'm checking Twitter, every few minutes. Like, did it happen? Did it happen? Like it could happen any moment. So and now the feel is much different. And I think
Yeah.
the world's focus unfortunately now has gone from Iran, where it should have been and should remain, onto Greenland,
Yeah,
where
isn't that
I have
crazy that
no
we're
idea.
talking
Why are we talking about that?
about Greenland?
That's a completely different uh, thing. There's a joke I could tell about that. I'll tell that in another episode.
There,
But again, I think that the important thing here that we learned, I learned today about a history that I wasn't really aware of, and the complexity of that history and what it means on all sides. The strength of the relationship between the Persian people and the Jewish people, and because I mean currently there's what, about around 10 to 15,000 Jews still,
very, very, very oppressed Jews that still live in Iran. Yes.
Mhm.
and us standing together is important regardless of our political beliefs, meaning whether we support this prime minister or that president. That is benign because we live in democracies where
Exactly.
that prime minister or that president won't be around beyond our ideals, which
Yeah.
are consistent. And that's a nice thing. Kaveh, I'm just so grateful to have you on and enlighten us. I think that what we want to do for our readership, or our listenership, I guess, is to say I think that we're going to come up with a template for a letter for your MP, and we'll put it up on Facebook, and we'll put it up on the website and Insta. Take a look at it, make it, personalize it a little bit, but send it off to your MP. Everything we do makes a difference. Let's stand united in this. Hey,
Absolutely. That would be a
all right.
wonderful thing to do. I appreciate your support.
Always, always, Kaveh. Thank you very much for being on the Schmooze, Jared. As always, it's been a blast.
Yeah, thank you, Kaveh.
I really appreciate it. This was a really great conversation. Usually I do these things and they're 3-minute media hits, so it's nice to be able to talk at some length about an issue.
Great.
All right. Thanks, guys.